Hello dear students, I am Professor Manpreet Uppal, Advisory Director with Tourism Philosophy and educationist, trainer and an executive coach, and of course along with that a communication expert. Together we now begin with our first unit on business correspondence, part 1. This unit, as I must tell you, will be covered over 2 videos. The first will take you through the basic fundamentals of a business letter, while the second will demonstrate various exhibits of the different kinds of business letters. Let us understand the structure of the video series before beginning with it in many details. The topics covered under the business correspondence series, and as we follow a structure would be, we begin with understanding the objectives of the videos. We then move on to the introduction of business letters, talking a little bit more on what are really business letters. We then move on to discover the essentials, of what goes into writing a business letter. Moving thereon to the style of a business letter, and finally culminating it into the planning of a letter. When I say culminating, that is only culminating part 1 of this video series. There is still more to come. Part 2 of the video series will take you through the different kinds of business letters, and largely we will be showcasing a lot of exhibits, a lot of the different types of business letters or the different kinds of business letters. So you will see an exhibit of each and you will be able to classify and categorize the different kinds as we move on. The kinds of business letters, just to give you an overview, that we will be covering in part 2 will include letters of inquiries, quotations, orders and acceptance. That's our first bracket. The second bracket would be letters of claims, complaints and adjustments. Third segment, we'll talk about agency letters. Moving thereon to status letters. Finally, moving on to the last part of it, and that would be the banking letters. Well, we'll wait for part 2 a little later, but for now, since we have looked at the objectives, let's try and understand what is it that we're going to arrive at into completion of these 2-part video series. So once a student completes the first 2 units, that is video 1 and video 2 of this series, you should be able to describe the essentials and style of a business letter. You should also be able to plan a business letter, and finally you should be able to write different kinds of business letters effectively. Let us now begin the unit with the introduction to the relevance of business correspondence. As we all know, a businessman is required to write letters very often, from the written purchase of sale of goods to the collection of debts to the payment of dues, making inquiries to placing orders, dispatch of goods, appointment of agents, distributors and many more. While letters become an imperative part of correspondence, this unit examines the different kinds of business letters. It further goes on to study the composition and style of business letters most popularly in use when we talk about business formal writing. Let's understand business letters a little more in detail. As we understand, commercial correspondence is an integral part and an instrument of carrying on business. The image of an organization depends on what impression is conveyed through the business letters. These letters help us to bridge the gap between 2 parties. They not only create the first impression, rather the closure of an agreement and also the relationship thereon between the parties involved thereon depends on the business letter. Therefore, business letters should be written very carefully and in such a manner that they are able to communicate the purpose effectively. At this point, I would reiterate, it is very important to be very effective and very impactful when you create a business letter. Therefore, while drafting a letter, I repeat, therefore, while drafting a business letter, the essentials of the business letter should be kept in mind. Let me now take you through with the essentials. So as we move on to this part, we'll talk about each of the essential in many detail. Number 1 essential, and that is on the top of the list because we are talking about clarity of thought. Business letters should be straightforward, clear. Let's not use too much of flowery language or too much of jargon. We don't want to confuse anybody. Business letters, I repeat, should be straightforward, clear and bring to light specific agenda. Every business letter should depict clarity of thought from each of its intents. It should clearly express the meaning which the writer wishes to convey. The writer thereby should have a very good command over the language for him or her to be able to express his intent clearly. Having achieved the number 1 essential of clarity, let's now look at the number 2 essential, which is unity of subject matter. Each business letter is written with some definite purpose in mind. Therefore, before writing a business letter, the writer must know the purpose or the subject matter of the letter. One business letter should cover only one subject matter. Including any more than one subject matter will tend to confuse the audience, which is not a good idea. So I repeat, it's always a great idea to cover only one message in one letter, and if you want to cover more than one messages, it's a good idea to use separate letters. However, when one message is supplementary to the other, we can sometimes use the same letter. In large organizations, different business matters are handled by respective sections. Thus, the principle of unity of subject matter is taken care of to a large extent. The next essential of writing the business letter is exactness and brevity. Businessmen, both as a writer or the receiver of the letter, has very little time. And so I'm sure you'd understand there is really no time to permit unnecessarily details. Let's skip what is not required. Let's stick to the core. Therefore, long sentences should be avoided. Short sentences, brief sentences always add on to making a letter more effective, more impactful. Each sentence should be brief, to the point, and should convey very specific information only. Repetition of words and messages, as interesting as it may sound to the writer, becomes extremely boring sometimes for the reader. You don't want your letter to be monotonous and unattractive. We want the letter to reach the target audience and to create the necessary impact. As such, it is recommended to avoid repetitive words, flowery phrases, unnecessary information. Please do not include any of this because it can result in delay of a letter and sometimes even might get you a negative response. Next element, once we have talked about the first 3, we look at level 4, which is the politeness element or the courtesy element. While it is very important to be polite and courteous in all of your human relations and all human interaction, it is all the more highlighted when we are writing a business letter. Courtesy and politeness are the core integrals of any business letter. It pays to be polite and courteous in all situations. In commercial correspondence, it has a special importance, as the written letter not only conveys a message but is also an instrument of image building. Remember, you may not be reaching the audience directly. Your first impression and the persona that you are is conveyed largely through the letter. So why try to corrupt that? Even in cases of disagreement, in fact, it is a great idea to convey your disagreement and yet be courteous. Please work at it. That's extremely important. Fifth essential, and we are now moving on to becoming convincing and effective. Business letters should always be convincing and effective. They should always convince the reader that the writer is sincere and honest and is interested in mutual benefit of both the parties. I would repeat here, business letters are written with the intent of a mutual benefit. We are not trying to at any point look at either the reader interest or the writer interest, and this should clearly fall through. Do not try to disguise any deceitful intentions by way of a flowery language. It will not work. For sure, it will fall through. For the letter to be convincing, for the letter to be honest, it is important that the writer maintains truthfulness in all statements made. Untrue statements, as easy as may sound, might be helpful for a while, but for sure they will be detected and the entire image of the sender will ultimately be spoilt. So it's a good idea to refrain from them. Moving on, we now talk about the appeal and the attraction of the letter. Yes, it is very important to create a good impression. Business letters definitely create a first positive good impression, and this becomes very relevant. A business letter should appeal to the eyes of the reader when he holds it for the first time, because this is what will ensure that the reader would go through the entire letter. Think about a letter which is not neatly written, the paper is not crisp, the writing is cluttered. Would you want to read? I'm sure you wouldn't. Definitely the letters have to be appealing, the letters have to be attractive. And to make them appealing and attractive, what is it that we can do? Let's use good stationery, decorative writing, systematic paragraphing, easy language and expression, and the objective of mutual advantage are the tools which make letters appealing and attractive. Innovative language, innovative phrases may sometimes be used. However, be very watchful. They may sound very effective, they may sound very exciting, but they should be used very carefully. When we sometimes use very fancy phrases just to make our letter very exciting and attractive, sometimes it may limit the purpose or the efficacy of the letter. They could sometimes be very misleading. So it's a great idea while using any kind of flowery language, phrase, be very careful, you know the correct meaning and only then use it. Finally, the last essential here would be maintaining the neatness along the letter. So although we have talked about the attraction and the appeal of the letter, it seems a great idea to also put it down as the last essential, neatness. It is a good idea to keep your letters as neat as possible. Try to skip all the spelling mistakes, all the grammatical mistakes. Do not cut out, do not overwrite. Also, if I may add at this point, the presentability of letter also goes into the folding of the letter. So think of a letter which is written neatly on a nice piece of paper, nicely paragraphed, nicely spaced, neatly folded into an envelope. For sure, your letter will find the necessary effectiveness. Moving on now to explore the elements that fall under the style of the letter. All business letters should have a proper format. Each element, including the heading, inside address, salutation, body of the letter, complimentary close and signature, when systematically arranged, make the business letters presentable and attractive. When written in a structured style, these letters prompt the reader to go through the letter and leave an impression on the mind of the reader, and that's for sure what we want. The following points, when observed, help in creating an effective and a presentable business letter. And so we should be watching out for those. These 4 points are: number 1, correct statement; number 2, direct approach; number 3, use of active voice in construction; and finally, avoidance of obsolete language. Let's take them up one by one and try and understand a little bit more. Number 1, I said we are talking about correct statement. All information and language expressed in the business letter should be factually correct. Do not try to exaggerate. Again, overstatement and exaggerations should be avoided, as they sometimes, rather than impressing, may hamper the writer's impression. An example in this regard is given below. So for example, when we say poor style, we fully assure you that such mistakes will never be repeated in future. Sounds good? But a better style could be, we assure you we shall do our best to avoid such errors. Doesn't that sound better? Number 2, let's look at maintaining a direct style. It is a good idea to maintain a direct approach in a letter as far as possible. There are many who write letters in the past participle tense, particularly in the last paragraph of the letter. This reflects the indifferent attitude of the reader and leads to gaps and rifts, rather than building relation between the two parties. So please be watchful of it. While you might be totally ignorant of the use of the language, you do not really want to create a rift. An illustration of the same harnesses what we just talked about. Look at the poor style version. Assuring you of our extreme desire to serve you, we are, etc., etc., etc. Better? We shall be happy to serve you, or we shall be grateful for your cooperation. I'm sure that sounds better to every ear. Number 3, use of active voice in construction. Wherever possible, active voice should be used in a business letter. Passive voice shows an indifferent approach again, which is likely to be misunderstood as a lack of interest, and this for sure can lead on to hampering relations just because of the tone and the language. Despite the content, you might lose the audience because you sounded indifferent simply because you used passive language. Try to avoid it. Finally, Let's move into positive construction. Using positive construction in business letters is always a good idea. Negative construction indicates a roundabout and a vague method of expressing, and nobody appreciates an unclear or vague expression. It is a good idea to talk straight, to talk clear to the point. Avoid unnecessary use of words and space. This just looks awkward and therefore should be avoided. For example, if I talk about a poor style of writing, I could say or I could write, "If you do not execute the order by the end of this month, we shall take legal action." But if I had to put it in a better way, I can say, "Please execute the order at the earliest to avoid inconvenience." I am directly hitting the point this time. Rather than confusing with a one long-liner statement, I have chosen to be using a brevity concept, few words, clear words, impactful words. Next, we look at avoiding the use of obsolete language. Old and cliche phrases developed over years and are still in vogue, still in common use. However, including using these words or phrases sometimes reduces the originality of a letter. When possible, let's try and use new words, new phrases. They should be conveying the same message and they would make the letter all the more attractive. This is of course possible only if the writer has a great command over language and vocabulary. The point can be illustrated by, let's say, the example, poor style, yours of September 8th. Better style, your letter of September 8th. Simple tweaking of one word and we've made it more contemporary. Let's look at another example. Poor style, our Mr. Daniel will call upon you soon. Better style, our representative Mr. Daniel will call upon you soon. Doesn't that make it sound better? Having understood the style of business letters, let's now move on to explore the next crucial bit, which is planning the letter. Any business letter should be planned before it is written. Planning of a letter is extremely important as planning as any other activity. Properly planned letters are always more effective and they definitely invite positive response. 3 steps should be taken to plan a successful letter. The first being assembling relevant facts. The second, selecting the right approach. And third, clarity of information to be provided. Let's take them up all one by one. Assembling the relevant facts. This by far is the first step in planning a letter. It comprises of collecting the facts relevant to contents that need to be shared. For example, the person to whom the letter is addressed, the policy of the company as to whether the letter is to be written on behalf of the company, previous correspondence on the matter with the person, the reasons for writing the letter, and finally, the information need of the letter. We move on now to selecting the right approach. There are basically 3 approaches, any of which may be adopted to start the letter. The first being the direct approach. Here the writer arrives directly at the subject matter, that is, straight away without giving any prelude or any introduction. For example, will you send us this? Will you do this for me? So I am not creating an introduction, I am straight away asking what I am here for. However, I might sometimes use an indirect approach, which means this starts with an explanatory or an introductive paragraph in the letter. It is used when you want to convey an unpleasant or a disappointing news. So for example, you might want to open up on a lighter note and then get on to the more disappointing information. Also, you could be using the persuasive approach. Here again, you will use an introductory paragraph. The purpose of this letter is to arouse the interest of the reader. This type of letter must gain attention, arouse interest, create a desire for the thing or idea to be sold, and finally, it must prompt the reader to take the action recommended by the writer. Moving on, let's look at preparing a plan. Before actually getting on to writing the letter, the writer must have clarity on what is it that is to be written in the letter. He must write down the points and then arrange them in a logical fashion. This brings in ease and efficiency in writing, along with also incorporating clarity for the reader. Therefore, before writing, one should clearly think about the purpose of the letter, the person to whom it is addressed, making the letter interesting, contents of the letter, the first paragraph to attract attention, and finally, making the letter sound natural. This brings us to the end of part 1 of this 2-part video series. we will in part 2 explore the different kinds of letters that may be used in business correspondence. Please keep watching. All the best.